requirements for products and services. So it's important under your requirements for products and services that you've already understood what the requirements are based on specification, based on standards, based on customer requirements, based on contractual project delivery, and how you demonstrate the necessary information on how you're going to meet those requirements. So you have to have that information available that you can provide as required. You also have to be able to demonstrate how you handle inquiries through to contracts, orders, delivery, and any changes associated to that. So this might not necessarily be change management in the process sense within your business, but it could be associated to changes in customers' requirements. So order changes, specification changes, changes at a site, timelines, things like that. So how are those changes captured? How are they documented? How are they properly communicated? And where required, where you give feedback in association to that. It's also important to recognise how you handle complaints. And you've got to think about the term complaint in quite a broad spectrum. It might not necessarily be a formal non-conformance. It could simply be associated to someone saying that they weren't happy how something was handled on an email or telephone inquiry. Might be somebody not happy about saying that they had fed back that they wanted parts delivered to a set location and they changed that location, but it's clear that that change that was made wasn't handled correctly by your organisation, and they are effectively complaining in the method and how it was handled. Handling and controlling customer property. This is quite a key one if you bring in customer property to your location and may use it as part of a project, or whether customer property is loaned to you as part of the services you provide. The key area here is you have to identify a number of things. One being, if you bring in customer property that brings in additional risk to your business, you have to consider what risk assessments you do and controls you put in place associated to that property. Additionally, on top of that, you have to think about the control associated to who owns that, so the traceability associated to that customer property. And you've got to remember as well that this can also be intellectual data. It could be designs. It doesn't necessarily actually have to be a physical item. As well as customer property, we have to think along the lines of, if you're a service organisation, when you go to a location that could be your customer's property, their facility, and you're doing an installation, you have to recognise that the controls that are put in place associated to that may involve that you have to follow certain protocol because you're entering into their property. So it could be that your processes, procedures and so on that you follow, risk mitigation measures, do not comply exactly or meet the requirements of what they expect. So it's the processes that you would take to follow their requirements. The last one in this area is really about contingency. So where that's required, what measures do you have in place that you can take contingency action? So that could be associated to things like changes in economic or governmental direction. Just now is a prime example of that, where many operations are shut down. So what activities and practices do you have in place for contingency action? It could be, like just now, quite extreme measures that you simply have to communicate to your workforce and communicate to your customers that actually, given the current situation, you cannot continue to operate the way you were and you cannot visit that site, your production lines are shut down, etc., etc. Or it could be a lesser level of that. So it's about the contingency actions that you would take to address depending upon the issues at hand. As well as that, remember, we have to think about what the requirements are in terms of what our customers' needs are and so on, but we have to think also outside of that. So when we spoke earlier about internal and external issues and interested parties, we have to think of that along the lines of our statutory and regulatory requirements. So if we were delivering a service going into an environment that was quite different from what we're used to working in, we have to consider how we educate ourselves and how we communicate that information about these changes in statutory or legal requirements at that site that we're going to work at. Could be different from what we're usually used to, and therefore we may need to bring about additional training specifically to go to that location. Or it might simply be that we have products and services that we are delivering into a new customer, a new industry that has some additional requirements over and above what we normally would have. So how do we ensure that we determine what those are, and how do we demonstrate that we've got the applicable controls for that? So within operations, we spoke before about the planning phase, about understanding what our risks are. Obviously, all organisations need to be able to demonstrate that they plan for emergency situations. These emergency situations can be obviously associated to environment, health and safety, and also business. So emergency situation at the moment could be that a number of organisations have put in place or maybe not put in place, but they have business continuity plans already in place, and they're having to act upon those business continuity plans. What are they doing to ensure that they have the correct preparedness in place, how they're going to respond to it, and importantly, how they recover from that emergency situation. And all of that's driven from mitigation measures that we try and have. Within this area, it is important to recognise the main elements here are also, of course, associated to emergencies to the environment and human health. So, for example, fire, explosions, potential for some emergency situation where it could have an impact on human life or the environment. So this is where we demonstrate that we have emergency response plans. We have shown that we have trained the appropriate people on the emergency response plans, where they have a role within that to play, where we've made others that would need to follow it aware of it. So part of our communication methodology in terms of our inductions and any changes that go about associated to that. And then of course we have to test it. It's all good and well having emergency plans and preparedness and responses in place and documentation of what we will do in these situations, but actually it's when these situations occur that we best find out how well they are working. So rather than ultimately we don't want to have a real situation occur, so therefore we want to test them, and this is one of the reasons why we test our emergency response items. This is why we do fire drills. This may be why we do a desktop exercise on an emergency response activity, maybe also do desktop exercises on our business continuity plans. As well as that, we have to think emergency and planning to respond to emergencies can come in all shapes and forms. What is an emergency to one company may not be to another. For example, if your company has to rely extremely heavily on the safety of the workforce and the complexity and functioning of your business around IT infrastructure, you may consider that you have an IT disaster recovery plan, which is a form of an emergency preparedness. And it may include or be a subset of a business continuity plan. It's important also that these things, where possible, are tested. And there's no one expecting companies to shut down their production, shut down their IT systems, set a fire to something to try and mimic that. What it's about is trying to get as close as possible to the actual event, to do a test on it, a drill, whatever you want to call it. And the whole purpose of that really is to evaluate that everyone is responding and the systems are responding as expected. When we evaluate it, it's important to recognise where there might be some weakness. It could be some of that weakness is associated to locations within your facility, or when certain work activities are going on, possibly sounders can't be heard, people can't be made aware. I've seen regularly sites where there is a subset location where there is some heavy work or high risk work activity goes on that's in a different location on a site. And often the PPE requirements there and the work activity that goes on means that these people may not hear the regular sounds that the office workers or the other people on the site might hear. So it's got to understand what those controls are that are in place, and when these situations occur, what responses you have to ensure that these activities can be demonstratable. And of course, as part of your internal audit process, that's a big significant part of it. Evaluation of your emergency preparedness and response sounds like an isolated thing, but actually it's just another form of auditing. It's just another form of checking that what you plan to do can be achieved, and where there are weaknesses, that you can demonstrate that you improve your systems, improve your methods, and importantly, like anything to do with change, that those changes and improvements are communicated in the workforce. Thanks for watching this video. Please take the chance to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on LinkedIn.